happening, everybody? How are y'all doing out there? Doing all right? Got a birthday coming up, although by the time you hear this, that would have passed, but hopefully so would have the hangover that would accompany it. Today's guest is drummer Hank Shteamer of Skryptor and Stats, and who is also an editor at Rolling Stone magazine. Hank and I got into his work with relatively unknown Cleveland, Ohio band Craw, and how seeing them at a young age would lead to both him starting a crowdfunding campaign to re-release their entire back catalog, and ultimately how all of those instances would lead to him forming Skryptor with David McClelland of Craw and Tim Garrigan from his other favorite band, Dazzling Killmen. We also talk a little bit about the changing world of music journalism, drum influences, the 90s, you know I'm a fan, and a whole lot more. And if you're interested in either the Craw re-releases or the Skryptor album, which has some great packaging, by the way, check out the links in the description of this episode for more info. And speaking of records, if you're looking to put out vinyl for your project, go on over to NewOrleansRecordPress.com to check out the vinyl coloring, packaging, mastering, and more options. And you can add it all up in the real-time quote generator to boot. Need assistance with designer packaging? They can help you there. And they can also print both 12 and 7-inch records in both 150 and 180 gram variants. And they print small runs of 100 and larger runs up into the thousands. And that is, of course, the one and only NewOrleansRecordPress.com. So give them a holler. Crash Bang Boom podcast can be found on iTunes Podcasts, my SoundCloud page, as well as my YouTube page, Stitcher, Luminary, Google Play, Podbean, and more. If you like what you hear, feel free to check out any of the previous 140 episodes and give me a like, a subscription, or a positive rating, or all of the previously mentioned as well. Throw in a glowing review as well. That'd be killer. All right, so here we go. Without further ado, a conversation with Hank Shteamer. Let's do it. Crash, bang, boom.
Crowds go mad with joy.
Hank Shteamer, what's happening, man? How you doing?
How's it going? Not too bad.
Thanks for catching up, man. I was checking out this new project of yours. Or I guess is Skryptor, is this the one album that y'all have done thus far?
Yeah, this is the one. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right on. And I know that there's some both Craw and Dazzling Killmen connections within that band.
That's correct. That's correct.
How did this band come to be?
So the history of Skryptor, I guess, is kind of like when I was probably about 14, 15, honestly. I mean, I'm 40 now, and this was that long ago that I was kind of this teenage metalhead, and then I discovered this band Craw, which is a Cleveland. I wouldn't even really know how to classify them.
Right.
I would just kind of say go listen to them, but extremely heavy, complex, intense band that I discovered at that time, and I was kind of like, there can be heavy music that's doesn't present itself as metal. Like I was coming from like a place of like Metallica, Pantera, some death metal, things like that, and then discovering Craw was like this whole other thing. So that band was like, like an obsession for me when I was a teenager, and fortunately they were touring a lot in the Midwest at that time. I'm from Kansas City, got to see that band live. And was
that when Neil Chastain was playing?
Neil Chastain was the first show I saw them play was in '95, and when Neil was playing with them. Still one of the best shows I've ever seen in my life by any band.
Really?
Astonishing band. I mean, I honestly saw them 6 or 7 times within a span of like 3 years. They toured a lot with this Kansas City band called Season to Risk.
Okay.
Great band. There's a lot of these kind of noisy, like mathy kind of post-hardcore, I guess, is what people might call it, but that doesn't even, I don't know. I think that the terms fall short with these bands.
Yeah. Keelhaul's another one, and obviously you had Will Scharf who would then be playing with them.
Right. Okay, so me and my friends were like 15 years old, and when this was happening, and the early Craw shows we saw, we were not old enough to get in. There was this whole thing where I had actually like called the label in advance of the first Craw show that I saw. I knew that it was going to be a 21 and over show, and inside the record they actually had a phone number. This was this label called Choke Incorporated at the time. And there was a phone number, and I had called it, and I had spoken to the gentleman, and I was like, look, I'm this kid in Kansas City, the Craw is coming. I was like, I've got to see this show. You've got to help me get in the show. I didn't know what I thought kind of strings he was going to pull.
Right.
But he actually gave me the phone number for Dave McClelland, who is one of the guitar players in Craw. I remember like being in like my parents' basement, like placing this phone call, and I was like, hello, hi, is this Dave? Like, I was given your number. Like, I'm this kid in Kansas City. You guys are coming here next month. They were playing like a Derek Hess art opening. And I was like, is there any way you can like help me get into the show? Because it probably the first album for a couple months. And in that couple months, my like, all of my metal listening had like receded to the background, and Craw was like, I was consumed by this record. I was like listening to like nothing else.
That's wild.
And so they were coming, and I spoke to Dave, and Dave was like, look, show up at this thing and we will see what we can do, and I was with, and I think he was kind of laughing. I think he like covered up the phone. I think he was living with Joe McTighe, the singer at that point. He covers up he says like, hey, it's some kid from Kansas City who's calling, like, I don't know, you know what I mean? Like, I can't even imagine now what that must have been like,
right,
to have him. They were probably in their early 20s or something. Anyway, so me and my friends showed up at the show. And yeah, we hung out with them. And Neil was very friendly. He was sort of the first one we were talked to. I think he was very kind of amused that there were these kids, these little kids who were like obsessed with Craw, and they were like, look, why don't we just pretend that we'll say that you're like our roadies or something like that. The doorman was very nice. They sort of put like X's on our hands, like, look, just don't try to drink and it's going to be cool. And we like carried some of their stuff in, and we saw Craw, and there were probably no more than like 15 or 20 people there. And I was coming from seeing bigger shows. I was going to see like Megadeth. I was going to see Pantera, White Zombie, the larger shows. I mean, it was the first time I had seen one of these kind of like life-changing small shows. My hands were like on the stage. It was one of those things where you have this impression of the thing from the record, and you're like, you have no idea what it will be like live. And then it turns out to be live even better. I can just sort of still just picture it. It was terrifying. I mean, Joe McTighe, I don't know if you ever saw them back in the day,
no,
but he just had this presence, and it was so creepy. Can't even really describe it. I mean, they did reunion shows, and there are some footage.
I saw the reunion show that they did.
Okay, right, exactly. Yeah, so you got a sense of it. They were just very unusual. You're a kid, you're growing up, you get used to this metal thing. Metal is a very codified way of like behavior, sound, style, dress. It's like there's all this like baggage that comes along with it. You know what I'm saying? Like, metal is like it's like a culture that you kind of just like inherit, and oh, okay, that's the guy with the long hair and the tattoos and the the spiked armbands. Like, it's like metal can still be kind of scary or whatever if it's done really well. It can still be very overwhelming, but Craw was just off the map. Do you know what I'm saying? Like it was as heavy, if not heavier, than the metal stuff I was listening to.
Right.
But it was like just from another place. Like, these were like weird, like English major guys, and Rocky was like, super like math whiz. Dave and Joe, I think they were super into like literature and stuff like that. Because me and my friends were kind of these young, like nerdy kids who, reading a lot and, checking out film and art and all that kind of stuff. I was like, oh wow, you can have all this heavy shit, but you can also have this kind of like intellectual or arty kind of side to it, and that cannot detract at all from the heaviness. And in fact, that can even make it seem that much more intense.
Yeah.
Now there's all these words for that stuff. It'd be like, oh, it's like indie, or it's post-hardcore, it's math. There wasn't any word for it. It was just like, this was, to me, the only thing it was music that I was like right next to it. I was like, my favorite band is coming around, and I can go see them and hang out with them. I'm not saying I was happy that there were only 10 people at the show for the benefit of Craw. I mean, I wish there would have been hundreds of people at the show, but it happened to have the side benefit that me and my friends could sort of, get to know them a little bit, and, probably pestering them and bugging them a little bit. But I mean, I think, for the most part, they were very nice. I mean, they were very cool. So this continued for like 2 or 3 years. And again, I think I saw them 6 or 7 times between like 95 and 97 when I graduated from high school. I came to New York, I think in 98 for school, and David moved up here shortly before. And I had been playing drums, probably right around the time I discovered Craw. I started playing drums around age 15.
Yeah, same here.
Yeah, right. And so I was, got to New York, was up at school. Dave and I, reconnected in New York. I felt slightly more like I was like a peer rather than just some little kid. I mean, I was still in college, whatever. And he was up here. He had moved up here and married this woman, Millie, and they were playing music together. And then eventually I got involved in playing music with them.
Yeah.
We played together for like from around 99 to like probably 03. played a lot of shows and did some, made a few recordings, and I listened back to them, and I think they're great songs that probably don't have the greatest drumming in the world on them, and
Yeah.
but I'm glad that I was able to like work with Dave in that situation. Eventually, like the thing kind of ran its course, and I left the band and was playing more with other people, like this band Stats, which originally was called Stay Fucked. So then Dave and I, we kind of just lost touch. Really, we were out of touch for a while, like 5, 6, 7 years.
Wow.
Honestly. And then Skryptor kind of happened because we got back in touch because of this Craw reissue thing.
All right.
The Craw stuff had gone out of print. Their first 3 records were impossible to find, even in this kind of internet age where everyone knows everything. Because everything, you feel like it's got to a point where everything gets rediscovered. People are like, oh, I'm totally familiar with that band that put out one 7-inch in 1992. You know what I'm saying?
Sure.
And Craw, for some reason, just wasn't. Like, they were kind of just lost.
Yeah.
I put together this Kickstarter, and along with a lot of other people, including Dave from Craw, the label Northern Spy, the label Aqualam, it was just sort of this big team effort, and we were able to raised like, $20,000 and put out this 6 LP box set for, the first 3 records of Craw, basically. And that came out in 2015. They played these 2 reunion shows, one in Cleveland where they're from and one over here at St. Vitus.
Yep.
And it was, it was honestly like, it was a dream come true. I mean, it was amazing. Anyway, as a result of the reunion, Dave and I, we sort of rekindled our friendship, basically. They had not been playing music a lot, at least in the more recent years. And, I think Dave and I started talking, and he had, and I had a practice space from Stats and from some other things I was doing. And he was like, oh, maybe it might be cool to get back in there. We started playing. I think by that time I felt like a little more able to kind of like hang. Stats, it was an active band. I felt like I was finally able to say, okay, I'm drumming the way that I want to be drumming.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think exactly how it developed. I think it was kind of like we were thinking that if we were going to do more with it, we wanted a third sort of voice in there. And, Dave had known Tim Garrigan from Dazzling Killmen when, they had played a lot of shows with the Killmen back in like 93, 94.
Right.
Those 2 bands kind of, if you talk to them, they kind of consider one another like kindred spirits. It's almost like a genre of 2. There's almost like no other band that you could compare either band to except the other one. And, Dave and I had these kind of structures, and we were like, maybe we should, talk to Tim about it. And Tim seemed interested in just sort of getting together and seeing what would happen. And we started playing, and, very quickly it was like I felt like he was sort of turning these sketches into like songs, he's just got a great sense of what to play that will like perfectly complement some rhythmic structure or something like that. So there was that maybe like a first batch of songs that were kind of like Dave and I had the sketches, and Tim would help us flesh it out, and then we would kind of arrange it as a group. And then after that we started writing as a band, and so we wrote several songs where Tim brought in an idea, or Dave did, or I did, and then we would, it was very collaborative. Like it was like a lot of this, songs on this record are like, it's like, that's my riff, that's Tim's, that's Dave's. I really didn't mention the Killmen and all that before, but I discovered them shortly after Craw. I think based on an interview I read with Rocky, the guitar player of Craw. I heard that time, and I was crazy about it. For me, it was awesome to be able to play with 2 of my favorite bands, really.
Yeah.
If you had told me when I was 15 that there would someday be a band with somebody from Craw and the Killmen, whether or not I was part of it, I still been, that's amazing.
Right.
And then like to be a part of it, that's great.
Going back to drumming, it sounds like you were starting to get into drumming right around that time. You said you were 15, so probably around the time when you were starting to go check out some of these shows.
Yeah, I think it was pretty close that time, and like my friends had like a sort of a hardcore / metal band. Some of my closest friends were very accomplished musicians at the time. It was like My friend Kyle had sort of been taking like blues guitar lessons and rock guitar lessons since he was very young. My friend Adam was kind of like a classical prodigy who'd been playing violin since he was like 4. Just like he was one of those guys that like, he was in middle school and was playing Metallica. Any sort of formative stages, I'm sure had been there, but like I didn't see it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I just saw them when they were just like they were just shredding. They had this amazing band, and they happened to have this drummer, this guy named Alex Mooney, who was probably one of my first sort of like key influences because I got to sort of watch him play up close. But just like, I believe he was a self-taught drummer, but he just had this amazing feel. He kind of played the hardcore beat in this way that just had this sort of like swing to it. It's almost like when I think of the way he played, I think of the way like Dave Lombardo plays like thrash metal, where it has this like swing to it. It doesn't sound so rigid.
Yeah.
Anyway, the Crack Babies were, they played a lot in Kansas City. They played with Season of Risk, and they did a lot locally, but the band sort of disintegrated around the end of high school, and the instruments were all there. And this guy Alex had left, the drum kit was still there in my friend Kyle's basement.
Yeah.
I'd been having a strong interest in the drums but not knowing anything about it. And I think Adam was like this instrumental prodigy where he could sit down at any instrument and just get it. He was a guitar player and a violinist, but he just like, he could hear a drum beat and just know how it was done. So these jams would start and they would kind of sit me down at the drums. Adam would be like, just do this. And I remember even very early on, they were like, oh, here's how you play like in 7. And like, this is like a song in 7 and just do this. And this is in 7. Yeah. And I was like, okay, like whatever. There were a few sort of things in the mix that I can remember. Like it was like Clutch was a big one.
Yeah.
Clutch was a favorite of all of ours. And also the drumming was very clean and sort of straightforward and like very, sort of stylish in retrospect, but very spare. You could hear what Jean Paul was doing.
Yeah, for sure.
And we had Transnational Speedway League and Passive Restraints EP, which were a big like favorites of me and all my friends. My other friend Drew would sometimes do vocals with us. They would do like covers of a lot of Clutch songs and things like that. And I remember being in like a school assembly one time, and there was that Clutch song Binge and Purge where it just has a like doom doom ka doom 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 ka, and just like playing that on my leg and be like, oh, I can do that now with the right hand keeping, you know what I'm saying? Like I figured out how to separate the right hand and the right foot. And then I got on the drum set like later that week and I was able to do it. And so I remember playing that. That was like this huge breakthrough, because once you separate your right hand, your right foot, you can kind of do most of like rock and metal just with that. And so like I remember figuring that out, and there was, Helmet was a big one. I definitely remember figuring out like the intro to that song I Know from Betty. Like we were all obsessed with that.
Everybody was obsessed with that. In the 90s, man, everybody, I've talked about it before, like everybody was copping John Stammer. Yeah. Man, I mean,
I know.
It was inevitable. It was unavoidable. It was inevitable. Everybody, his influence was so widely.
It's wild.
Everybody was into it. It was impossible. I hadn't heard anybody play drums like him.
How old are you?
I'm 43.
Okay, so we're roughly in the same.
But I definitely remember when Helmet came out, and I was going to see him live all the time, and loved seeing just the power that he played with. And, oh man,
I feel like most of my favorite bands from that time I've gotten to see either at that time or in reunion shows. Helmet with Staying Here is the one that I did not get to see at that time.
No way.
Super heartbreaking. I remember there was a show, like I believe it was Helmet and the Melvins, that for whatever reason I missed at that time. I don't even think I was like hip to the Melvins at that time, since Dale has since become one of my favorite drummers.
Right.
But
super unique drummer for sure with that guy.
Yeah, and like I kind of, a part of me almost wishes that I had been exposed to him earlier, because he's such an education. There were the sort of those early epiphanies, but there were later ones too, where you would hear the way he used, the kind of like the use of the toms, the like on Houdini, and the super laid back, just like crushing feel. That's the thing. So there's all these kind of early things in the mix. This kind of like, Jean Paul from Clutch, Stanier, Quicksand and Jawbox were also big ones. I actually got to meet Zach from Jawbox the other night. I was kind of speaking with him about this, about how like Stanier, Alan Cage from Quicksand, and Zach Barocas from Jawbox were all happening at the same time. Heavy music that wasn't necessarily metal, quote unquote.
Same, yeah.
You know what I mean?
It's an extension back on to what you're talking about with like what Dazzling Killmen and
totally. Yeah, and the drumming was all so ass kicking and like had amazing groove. Another one was Doug Scharin from this band June of 44, who I got. I mean, they were That band was insane live. I don't know how, I mean, I think they may be a little bit underrated. Their records are good.
Yeah.
But I don't think that they were him and the bass player Fred Erskine, who was also in Hoover and Crown 8 Ruin and some other bands.
Mm-hmm.
That was one of the best rhythm sections I've ever seen, like in any kind of music. I mean, Doug Scharin was a virtuoso. I don't know if you ever got to see him.
I never did get to see him. No.
Monster player. They've actually been playing some shows in Europe, June of 44, and I'm hoping they'll come here.
Nice.
Because they were a tremendous band. And Doug Scharin, he also played in this band Rex, which was sort of like this almost slow folk country thing. There was one show I saw where Rex opened for June of 44. And it was like he played two sets.
Yeah.
And I was blown away. He was another one of those players. I don't know exactly what his background was, but virtuoso. Do you know what I'm saying? He's not some like punk guy.
Yeah.
Like he had these rolls and he was just had this fluidity and this feel. Definitely like started listening to things like John McEntire, Tortoise, things like that. You know, and Rush was in there too, but Rush was inaccessible to me.
Right.
From a drum perspective, there wasn't anything I heard on a Rush record that I felt like I could even remotely try to copy. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like it just was like, okay, well that's insane, but it's not available to me. And I was also listening to a lot of like death metal and stuff, but again, I didn't have a double bass pedal. I was very into Pete Sandoval from Morbid Angel, but so the death metal was. And Rush and all that stuff, that was just like, hey, great drumming. I'm going to admire that from afar. These other guys, it's like, yeah, I could start up with some of that. I could maybe, play a Clutch song and sound decent or something like that. I think when I would say I became halfway decent was when all that stuff later linked up with this more classic rock stuff. And when I was able to be like, oh, like Bonham, like, Bill Ward from Sabbath.
Oh, yeah.
Like, and Levon Helm from the band became like one of my very favorite drummers.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh.
Because I just loved the feel and the laid back kind of, I love that like laid back kind of like groove.
Oh, yeah.
I feel like
fantastic at playing that for sure.
Yeah, just the kind of pocket thing, you know, very into like, obviously the James Brown drummers or the Meters or things like that. Or, you know, so there was all that early stuff that you were like, oh, this is awesome, and I'm like a teenage drummer or whatever. Then later I was like, oh, then it's like, actually, this is what drumming, you know, even like Ringo. I started to clue into that stuff. You know, these people who are like, they play their instruments, they just sit down the drums and just rip, and it drives you insane. Like, and you're like, it's almost like because they're not sweating it, they're able to just be so natural with it. Do you know what I mean? How do you, like this thing of like, how do you play extremely like hectic music in a way that feels almost chill or something like that? It's this weird paradox, like kind of like I was talking about like Lombardo. Like you don't hear Lombardo ever as fast as he's playing and ever think he sounds like he's rushing. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? Right. Where it's like a lot of stuff sounds tense. Sure. Like, and I think I just sort of started to pay attention to that. And me and Tony and Joe, who's sort of like my musical sort of soulmate, like he and I, Joe Petroselli, guitar player, we played in this band Super League Cat together, then Stay Fucked, and then Stats. And so me and Joe and Tony, I think around probably when we changed the name from Stay Fucked to Stats, it was kind of like we worked a lot on this feel thing. We would play riffs, you know, would do that thing, which I'm sure you know from, you know, your bands where you just like play the riff forever and just kind of try to like figure out how to, so it sounds the most massive and the most just like, you know, apocalyptically heavy and like groovy and just kind of like laying back in it. And I feel like that was where it was some degree of like respectability. I could be like, okay, I'm like a drummer. I'm like thinking like a drummer. And I feel like I'm a naturally kind of, you know, edgier, kind of a hyper kind of a person.
Most drummers are.
Yeah, right?
Especially ones that play rock.
Yeah, and so to get that kind of lazy, laid back thing was I felt like I had to like, it didn't necessarily come naturally.
I bet.
You know what I mean? So I feel like I had to like, so now I feel like when I listen to my playing, what I'm really listening for is just, does it have a good groove? We
mentioned Will earlier from Keelhaul, and I met him at a Keelhaul show in Brooklyn, and I was just asking him about his drumming or whatever, and I think I've mentioned it before on this podcast, but he said, I asked him like some of his influences, and I think he said literally, oh man, you know, I just puke up purple shit everywhere.
Yeah.
That was what he said.
Will is funny because he's sort of like he's like so self-deprecating that it's sort of like almost even hard to have like a straightforward conversation with him. He's like the nicest, like funniest guy, but he kind of has that quality. You almost can't learn this quality, but the quality of like, he's not afraid of fucking up.
Oh, for sure.
And I feel like if you're sort of a more uptight person, like a fuck up is a fuck up, where if you're a drummer like that or a musician like that, you're just playing.
Yeah.
And there might be moments where it sounds like quote unquote like off of some arbitrary standard of perfection, but it just doesn't matter.
Right.
Because it's just part of this like flow.
Mm-hmm.
And they've like that's a real, when somebody can like detach themselves from like any sort of standard of like, they can be so commanding and like confident and so like loose at the same time that it just, that concept of right or wrong just kind of goes out the window, and it's just like one thing.
Oh yeah, you're just going for it.
Yeah. And it's very, I don't know how I've tried to like latch on to some of that. If you're not that kind of player, you're kind of not that kind of player. I don't know how you like learn and get better, but then also like retain or invite in like chaos.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Like Kevin Shea is a player like that who has this amazing kind of, if he wants to sound very chaotic and you know, flow within a structure, he can do that. Zach Hill, obviously, players like that, where it's like Greg from Deerhoof, Brian from Lightning Bolt, this kind of thing where it's like there's a chaos factor that's mastered and part of it. Yeah. It's not accidental. They're so comfortable that they can like let something get out of control and it's still somehow in control.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. And
I really admire that, but I have a very hard time feeling like I can get that.
Absolutely.
Do you know what I mean?
So you mentioned obviously writing earlier. I know you wrote a book about the Ween record.
Yes.
Chocolate and Cheese, is that it?
Yeah, that was it. Yeah.
And then obviously you've been writing for Rolling Stone. You were with Time Out for a little while. How have you seen the quote unquote music industry sort of change? I guess we're at this point from a music perspective, just we're in the streaming zone.
It's like I definitely come from a different time, buying CDs, buying records.
Right.
When I was first writing about music, I mean, yeah, certainly it was like, getting promo CDs from labels and stuff like that. I was writing about a lot of jazz, like around like the early 2000s, and a lot of doing reviews for like the All Music guide, like allmusic.com, and, smaller magazines like Signal to Noise, all about jazz times, just a lot of jazz stuff. Honestly, that was like a way for me to break in like as a writer, because it was kind of an accessible zone. Definitely like when I was at Time Out, probably like mid 2000s. Yeah, CDs coming in the mail, and this is like advanced copy of some record, and very like tight lid on things in terms of like piracy and all that stuff. Now it's just kind of like it's Bandcamp and Spotify, and I feel like for me, it's been like a fairly like straightforward transition. It's just like, before a lot of my music was physical media, and now I just buy stuff on Bandcamp all the time, and I buy stuff on Amazon MP3 all the time. Ultimately, like I consider myself basically just like a fan who happens to have this, these outlets or whatever, and I just enjoy communicating about music, and like, the writing sort of came out of that. But like, this whole thing about like critic or having some kind of authority of it. I'm just a person who loves music who... I think this came from like a friend of mine, Ben Young, who's like a sort of a jazz scholar and kind of a mentor of mine who I worked at this college radio station, WKCR. It's like there's the music first, and then there's what the people directly involved in the music say about it, and then there's everything else. And that everything else, like ultimately, and like I say this as someone who like is, essentially writes about music for a living, like it has to be remembered that it's secondary. It's like this stuff is like, the music is sort of forever, and a lot of the other stuff is kind of pretty ephemeral. Ultimately I feel like the best that you can do is through the writing kind of maybe steer someone towards something that they might not have checked out.
Sure.
You know what I mean? That's like, to me, that's always been like that, and then meeting and interfacing with people whose music I love and being able to just talk to them about it. Yeah. Like, to me, that's the thing. It's kind of great to talk to people who maybe haven't been asked questions that much about their music. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. Like to talk to those Craw guys, I think some of the, the kind of oral history that I did along with the box set, like I think those guys, I don't think they'd really talked at length about Craw ever, and like, to speak to some of those guys for like several hours at a time, and to then be able to like print that story for, again, the limited amount of people who care. It's not supposed to be a bestseller. It's supposed to be, it's a niche thing.
Right.
Like I just wrote this piece about Anthony Braxton. Are you familiar with him? He's sort of like a avant-garde jazz, classical composer, improviser, just kind of this avant-garde music figure who's been doing stuff. He's been around for like 50 years.
Wow.
He made a new record with Nels Klein, the guitar player.
Oh, I love Nels.
Yeah,
He's
so
awesome.
Nels and Greg from Deerhoof are on the record, and Taylor
wow.
Hobynum, who's this great cornet player. They made an improv record together. It's kind of this intergenerational thing, and like people coming together from like different scenes. And I interviewed Braxton about kind of he's mainly known as kind of this avant-garde dude, and he talked a lot about his like kind of rock and pop influence. He's very into like Jimi Hendrix and James Brown, a lot of stuff that you wouldn't necessarily hear him talk about.
Yeah.
And again, like, yeah, I want to do that interview because I just want to know what he has to say about it. And it's just a byproduct of like curiosity about it. It's not like some kind of thing of like, it's not any more to it than that. It's just like, I'm a fan who wants to know stuff. So that's why I like to talk to musicians, especially talking about music with like the people who made it. I want to know more about music because it's like my life. You know, whether it's the writing or the playing, music is everything for me.
So obviously we're sitting here talking on this podcast. You yourself, you've been doing some podcast stuff, and I know an ongoing interest of yours is the crossroads, so to speak, of maybe some of heavy metal world, and then jazz.
Totally.
So that's cool. Is it heavy metal and bebop? Is that the name of the?
Yeah, it's called Heavy Metal Bebop. It's like started as an interview series that I was doing on different websites, and it was like print Q&As, and over time, the transcribing becomes sort of arduous, and I was having trouble just making time for it, but I wanted to keep doing these interviews. Again, like I said, I like talking to musicians, and one of the things I find most interesting is when you're talking about a musician who's known for one thing, but they're super into this other shit that you might like. This piano player Craig Taborn, I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. Amazing jazz piano player who is obsessed with death metal, and just like you'll see him. I think this thing started because I saw him at a Portal and Gorgut show. I was like, that's Craig Taborn. I love his jazz playing. I just want to talk to him about this. Like, what's going on here? And ultimately you find he's just like anyone else, again, like I was talking about before, this genre thing is basically completely irrelevant. You're just looking for something real.
Other than marketing, as a conversation's sake.
Yeah. And I say this as someone, again, who has this podcast or interview series based around the idea of genre, but ultimately it's based around the idea that the genres, like the more you dig into it, like how irrelevant they are. Like I said, like I'm playing this like heavy math rock, and I'm getting just as much influence from Levon as from most drummers who are playing anywhere remotely in this style.
Yeah.
Ultimately it's just like, what are the concepts that transcend the style, which is the kind of this earthbound way of thinking about music. But like there's all this other stuff. Yeah. There's just like a feeling you get. Like I remember seeing Milford Graves, a great like sort of free jazz, kind of unclassifiable percussionist, one of the greatest improvisers on earth. I remember saw him play at the Stone, John Zorn's place down on Avenue C on one night, and the next night I saw this band Revenge, who's this Canadian black metal band. Are you familiar with them? Just crazy aggressive. This guy, James Reed, who plays in Revenge, one of the greatest metal percussionists I've ever heard. The music just radiates like hatred, basically. You know what I'm saying? And like I am like a very like, generally a mellow person, but like like I said, when I want music to go, I want it to go as far in a certain direction. That's why Morbid Angel really it's hateful. It's hateful. And that's what I want out of that music. It's very spiritual at the same time. And like, it's just nihilistic expression. You know what I mean? Right. And it's beautiful. Yeah. And it's in that way. James Reed, monster drummer. So I saw Milford Graves and James Reed on consecutive nights that Revenge played Vitus. Exact same thing. Sensation of like being in the room with this other worldly kind of force. Yeah. Do you know what I'm saying? Like that's what this whole heavy metal bebop thing is, like really just like wanting to like talk about the stuff that transcends the kind of, categories, blah, 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 blah. And also I just happen to really like both those styles of music. And they're also two kinds of music that they sort of share this quality of like virtuosity on one hand and kind of like uncompromising. Neither of them are really related to like pop. It's like you could be very celebrated for being very yourself in both those kinds of music. And obviously they're both like a feast for a drummer.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean? To me, it's not that weird. It's like they're both essentially like at this point like niche.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if jazz can be overground or underground, but seeing a show at the Stone, seeing like an improv show at the Stone is not that different than seeing a punk thing at Death by Audio. It's the same vibe.
Yeah.
And now those scenes in New York are all crossing. Like
Right,
Colin
exactly.
Marston records all these improvisers, and you go to the Stone and see Corrales play, or you can see Mick Barr from Corrales play with Mark Edwards, who played with Cecil Taylor in the 70s. It's just like I'm into that. Let alone like Mahavishnu Orchestra,
Right?
Which when those two things are combined. Like I think what I like about doing these interviews, like a lot of the biographical details might be out of the way, so we can just sit there and hang out and talk about music.
Yep.
Do you know what I mean? Which I enjoy. They're not super like, you have a new record out. Like, tell me about your new record. You know what I mean? Like the talking points that I might have to do another interview, which serves a function and it's great.
Right.
But this is more just like, hey, let's just get into some shit and talk about. You know what
absolutely.
I mean? Like Ches Smith.
Yes.
I don't know if the episode will be out by the time this airs, but like I talked to him about, he plays with Trevor Dunn's Trio Convulsing, he plays with Mark Rebo, all kinds of cool avant jazz stuff. But he's amazing rock drummer. Fudge Tunnel, the band. So he played with Alex Newport of Fudge Tunnel in like a band after that.
Okay.
So like super hard hitting rock too.
All right.
And I was just listening back to that interview I did, and he's talking about Tony Williams, he's talking about Dale Crover, and it's just like, ultimately, like the boundaries are not important or valuable to anyone. It's just like like any right-minded person should be able to see Tony and should be able to see Dale and be like, that's awesome and that's awesome. I don't have to choose. That's a great thing about music.
Certainly, that's the way I operate.
Yeah, it's like nobody's asking you to choose.
Yeah.
In every other part of your life, you have to like decide, like politically or whatever else.
Right.
Like, decide. Pledge allegiance to one thing or another. But that's the great thing about music, is that like, who cares?
Cool.
So
Hank,
anyway.
it was good talking to you, man.
Yeah.
We'll have to catch up soon, and I'll keep my eyes open for you if you got some Skryptor shows or something coming out.
Awesome. Yeah, there is one in August 10th. We're playing with this great band called Sheer Accident. So if this will be up before then.
Absolutely.
That is happening.
There it is.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, man.
All right,
Hank,
awesome.
have a good one, man.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks to Hank for hanging. It's kind of hard to say. Hank for hanging. Keep your eyes open for his projects between Skryptor and Stats, and definitely check out that Craw re-release. I'm definitely a fan of that material. Check it out. All right, everybody. We'll catch you on the next one. Crash, bang, boom.